Different views, different views.
I know your story.
From different Jews.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Karina Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
2 Point.
Joining us now in studio is Chief Christopher Martin of the Brewer Police Department. Thank you so much for coming in.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Welcome, Chief.
Thank you, sir.
Recently, you testified in strong support of LD 1288. Tell us, what was that bill about?
We were trying to turn back a previously enacted bill that basically doubled the thresholds for presumptive amounts of trafficking and furnishing in our harder drugs, and particularly with fentanyl. We're quite concerned about that, and our problem is the worst it ever has been, and we didn't believe it was the right time to continue down a permissive track.
Now, I've seen that this has been voted out, right? It was a divided report.
Yes.
Okay. I think you were telling us earlier, this began with LD 1675. We have in front of us recommendations for a sensible drug policy. 2019 is about 50 pages long.
Yeah, that's kind of the genesis of this whole movement, at least in Maine. There was a group of people that wanted to have some very permissive drug policies, social justice reform, and it followed a national platform we were seeing across the country, particularly along the West Coast. And some of the key contributors were current elected officials down in Augusta, and nearly everything that they had in there has been introduced as legislation since January of 2019. So the bottom line is the ultimate goal here was to have the decriminalization of drug possession. User amounts is what they were claiming. And then they've had a series of things below that would help kind of indoctrinate us, I guess, into reaching that decriminalization. As far as law enforcement goes, a lot of the subsequent things that were proposed has been death by 1,000 cuts. It's really marginalized the law enforcement role on being able to tackle this drug problem. So prior to all of this, we had a lot of support for enforcement, but we had very little access to treatment and recovery. And law enforcement were the people that were championing the need for treatment and recovery resources. We were begging for it. And there was a major political shift, 2019, 2020, and this was rebranded as a health issue, not a criminal justice issue. And the pendulum swung completely the other way, and we started seeing law enforcement's role become marginalized. And what's happening in Maine is not unique. It's happened everywhere else, particularly along the West Coast, that have used these same type of strategies. It's led to a decay, and we're actually hurting more people than we're helping. Where we want to be with all these public policies is we want to have equal investments, pragmatic investments, not just in enforcement, but in treatment, recovery services, and also educational demand prevention. We're not doing a whole lot with that either. And if we invest in those 4 areas, I think that we can have a manageable drug control strategy. But if we're all doing one way or all the other, we're not going to have the impacts we want.
What specific policy, either proposed or has passed, have you seen that are continuing the decriminalization, which affects the way law enforcement operates in the state of Maine?
Yep, that's a great question. I'm glad to answer it. Ever since 2019, 2020, decriminalization of drugs has come up at least twice. I anticipate we're going to see it again in the near future.
So let me ask you this. If they decriminalize it, do they mean that they want it to be legal to have a certain amount of fentanyl or cocaine?
Yes, it would be what they consider user amounts, and under existing statute, which we can get to later, that could be up to 2 grams, 4 grams, or whatever. But that was the goal, is to decriminalize the possession of it so people aren't charged anymore. Safe injection sites, we've seen that at least twice. Each time it gains more traction. And the important thing to remember about a safe injection site is, in order for this to work, you have to set up a de facto decriminalized zone, because people have to procure the drugs and bring the drugs to this supervised use facility. And if you don't keep law enforcement away, then they get busted, right? You're going to have to establish some buffer zone around there where people can freely travel to this place and from this place without law enforcement interference. So it really is decriminalization on a smaller scale. And we're seeing another bill that's going to try to push to make that legal in Maine this session. One of the things they were successful with is they took our presumptive amounts for trafficking and furnishing and they doubled them. And that's what we're seeing in LD 1288. We're trying to reverse that back to what it previously was. Our Good Samaritan bill, that was passed two sessions ago. And the proponents for this, they're very proud because we have the most protective Good Samaritan bill in the country. I choose to use a different word. We have the most permissive Good Samaritan bill in the country. And under this, what it means is if you're having an overdose or you are assisting in any capacity someone having an overdose, whether you're calling on the phone, pointing the ambulance in, holding somebody's hand, putting a warm washcloth on their head, whatever it may be, any form of assistance, no matter how little or how great, then you're immune from prosecution for a series of crimes. Right now, you cannot be prosecuted to have any amount of drugs or any type of firearm offenses. So as long as you're either the person overdosing or the person assisting, you are immune from prosecution. You could have 2 kilos of cocaine and an AK-47, and we can't use that as evidence, and we can't charge anybody. Under Maine statute, we can't touch them.
And is that only firearms and drugs that you cannot touch them, or are there other offenses that you're not able to touch them?
There are other minor offenses, but the things that we can charge people with is if it's child endangerment, sexual assault, murder. Primarily, they're immune from any level of drug possession, whether it's trafficking or furnishing or any type of prohibited person firearm offenses under this bill.
Or if they had 3 or 4 warrants and you guys are looking for them, you probably couldn't pick them up either?
No, not during that event. We couldn't. So then we saw in the past couple of legislations, they worked on trying to have roundabout ways to marginalize the law enforcement footprint, particularly with criminal addiction and drug interdiction. There was a bill that proposed to ban pretextual stops. So pretextual stop, I'll give you an example. Neighbors have complained about a drug house, frequent visitors, short periods of time. The police start watching the place. We see a vehicle pull up, a person runs in, 2 minutes later runs out, gets in the car, drives off. We have to have a legal reason or violation to stop them, right? So let's say that they're speeding, run a stop sign. As long as we have a legal violation, even though in our minds we're trying to further look into what could be illegal drug activity, that's a pretextual stop. And we had a bill that was trying to ban that, and it's a very powerful tool for law enforcement.
It didn't pass.
It did not pass. I believe the governor stood firm on that one. We had profiling bills that did get passed. Keep in mind that profiling, not only is it illegal, unethical and immoral, you're going to lose your licensure through the Maine Criminal Justice Academy.
Of course.
But under this profiling bill, even though they didn't have evidence that such things were happening, and if they were happening, there's severe consequence, they've now forcing all law enforcement agencies in the state to record contact information data on every motor vehicle stop. So that did pass. There was a bill that was proposed to cut funding for the Maine Drug Enforcement Agency by 50%.
Yes, I remember that.
Fortunately, that didn't pass. We had a bill that was trying to restrict participation with federal law enforcement, particularly on asset forfeiture, where they raised the threshold of you had to have a case that was involved in more than $100,000. There is currently a bill in the legislature that wants to restrict our law enforcement participation with ICE.
Yes, I'm hearing that throughout the state, that certain city council members are being inundated with letters. I heard this about Bangor Police Department not to be able to participate with ICE. So I've been told.
Well, it kind of falls in line, I guess, with what we're seeing nationally and with the mindset of sanctuary cities or communities. Our position in Brewer is that we're going to work the case wherever it takes us, and we're going to work with all of our counterparts, state, local, county, federal. It doesn't matter what branch it is. If that's what we need to do, that's what we do. As we have in the past, for the past 30 years that I've been at the Brewer Police Department, we're going to work with our law enforcement counterparts when it's appropriate. There was a bill that originally was proposed to decriminalize homelessness, and originally the bill was going to provide exemption from prosecution for things such as open-air drug use, indecent exposure, littering, disorderly conduct, trespass. The proponents of that bill felt as though law enforcement contact was dangerous to these marginalized communities of unsheltered individuals. And if that bill had passed as written, then these type of behaviors that you encounter in your public space, law enforcement would have zero tools to deal with. Fortunately, the bill didn't pass as written. It ended up getting watered down into a form where we have a mandated statewide policy that requires us to offer information about access to services. We still have the option or the discretion to enforce the law when appropriate. They also went after qualified immunity. They tried to limit that. Qualified immunity, in a nutshell, protects us as individual officers from frivolous lawsuits. As long as we're acting in accordance with the law, we are protected from individually being sued. And that keeps you out of, imagine all the frivolous lawsuits that would happen every time you take enforcement action.
Absolutely.
So nobody would want to do the job. So you have this qualified immunity. Now, if you operate outside the law, then qualified immunity doesn't apply. But they were trying to remove that, which really would have decimated law enforcement in the state of Maine. And the last one I have on my list is last legislative session, we decriminalized prostitution. Now, it's still illegal to solicit a prostitute, but we did decriminalize. The interesting thing here is that under the old statute, if you were a victim of human trafficking, then you were already exempt from prosecution. Okay, and of course, it would never be appropriate to charge somebody under those circumstances. So there was a mechanism there, but this was a broader intent to decriminalize a lot of things. So we decriminalized the prostitution. So you put all these things, don't look at these things from a standalone, each individual concept. Take the 1,000-foot view and look at, in 2019, we have this coalition of people that launched this report. And in this report, they said, these are all the things we want. And now we look at fast forward to today, and all of those things have been introduced. So this has been a very coordinated and focused effort. And again, it's a death by 1,000 cuts. The ultimate goal here is to take a lot of these, what they consider crimes of disorder, and remove the accountability, and again, ultimately to decriminalize drugs. That's what we've seen in Maine for the past 3 legislative sessions.
So I guess my question to you, Chief, is Kroon and I were down at the State House last week, and when we were talking to some of our local legislature, we always got interrupted by a lobbyist here and there. And I'm just wondering, is there a lobbyist group that's pushing all this drugs into the state of Maine? I mean, why all of a sudden it's an unbelievable amount of drugs coming in and people don't want to have laws against it?
Okay, I'm going to tackle this question in 2 parts. Yes, there is a coordinated group that are continually down in Augusta pushing for these social justice reforms. And it's a conglomerate. Tip of the spear is a recovery advocacy project nonprofit. And they're very well organized, and they're grassroots. And a lot of the people they train up on how to testify and such things, they're also people in recovery. And they have pushed for a lot of great things. They have pushed for a lot of things, that greater access to naloxone, greater access to clean needles, open more funding for treatment centers, more funding for recovery support.
Which is needed.
Yes. They've done some wonderful, wonderful work, but then you have this part where they're really key on pushing toward these safe injection sites and decriminalization. The individuals that have been trained up, again, as part of a national organization, there's a lot of out-of-state money that's helped fund things, get things going. We're seeing the exact same type of things happening elsewhere in the country with the exact same platforms. I think.
And how are those working out?
Well, they're gaining traction. It just depends on where and what the politics are of that particular area. West Coast is pretty successful with a lot of these things. Probably not going to work as well where it's more of a conservative-based, and I'm not talking political conservative, I'm just talking a more conservative mindset within the communities. Anyway, back to this, you have that group, and then there's a coalition of other groups that all you have to do is look at who provides testimony on a lot of these bills I mentioned, and it's the same people, same talking points time and time again. That's your conglomerate, and they're working, and they're very good at what they do, and they are doing a lot of good things. It's just hard to get behind them knowing what the impacts of these things would be. But my hat is off to them for the good work that they are doing. Now, why do we have all of these drugs? It's not just about laws being passed. Consider some of these public policies that are being proposed and passed. That's akin to maybe fertilizing your garden so that the soil is better. It promotes more growth. And so if we pass these very permissive policies, like we have on some of them, then our soil or our marketplace is very fertile for people to make money on the drug economics. That's like we're going to be supportive of that business through this lack of involvement in law enforcement. It really started with a wide open, porous border. That provided a lot more access to drugs and quantity of drugs, particularly in the Northeast. When the border was effectively shut down during COVID, there was a backlog, a stockpile, if you will, with the Mexican cartel of methamphetamine. And we had the drug czar at that time. He came to Maine for a visit, and he actually held a meeting at the Brewer Police Department. And he warned us. He said, I'm going to tell you right now that the cartels are sitting on stockpiles of methamphetamine because it's getting harder for them to move large quantities across that border. But when these borders open up, they're going to flood your market with their meth. So remember, before that, all you're reading about all these these lab busts and 1 pots and all this stuff in the paper all the time. Well, we don't have that anymore because we have high-quality Mexican cartel methamphetamine. And everything he said was true. We have large amounts of methamphetamine in the state. And so when that border opened back up, and our border was really not being enforced all that well for a fair amount of time, and then we have the proliferation of fentanyl. So little history lesson on Maine is back in the late 90s, we had a opioid prescription problem. We had a high demand of people who were addicted to opioid pills. We didn't have a whole lot of heroin, and heroin at that time had a terrible, terrible stigma. You kind of viewed that as Skid Row needles, and it's not a very marketable thing. Well, come around 2000, 2001, heroin starts flooding the market. Now, that's about the same time that we're getting pretty good at reducing supply sources for these diverted pills. We started passing laws that required narcotics contracts, one doctor, one pharmacy. We a prescription monitoring program. All these things made it harder to divert these in any quantity. The demand is still there, so they switched to a like product, which was heroin. I remember in 2000, I could probably count on one hand, at least in the Brewer area, that we knew that were intravenously using heroin. By 2003, it had exploded. Back then, east of the Mississippi was predominantly a Colombian-controlled market, so the heroin that we had in our market was pushed through the same cocaine supply chains, and they were pushing a 90% pure heroin, which meant that you can snort it. Now, that's a very marketable product. So people were snorting it. Now, if they were already crushing and snorting other pills or snorting cocaine, you didn't have the same type of stigma with that type of use, and nobody ever envisions their journey ending with a needle in their arm. So heroin really takes off. Then we have the introduction, well, our solution to this heroin problem is going to be 1 methadone clinic, 2 methadone clinics, 3 methadone clinics. And when those things were promoted as our solution back in the early 2000s, it was going to be, we're going to have a companion counseling piece, and it'll get them off it. Well, fast forward to today, I don't think the companion counseling piece was a big part of it. The clinics have done quite well, right? And our problem is worse than it ever has been. During that same time, as we opened up the methadone clinics, we saw a greater availability of cocaine. And why was that? Well, because people that started taking methadone, it peaks in your bloodstream at about the 4-hour mark. We were actually having crashes where people were driving, they'd feel good, and at the 4-hour mark, they're nodding off and they're crashing. Well, guess what they started to do? They started to self-medicate with a stimulant, i.e. cocaine, get you through it. Okay? That was back in 2003-ish. So I've been at this a long time, and we slowly saw the demand creeping up. And then in the past 5 to 10 years, particularly the past 5 years, this border being porous, and most of the drugs that are coming into this country are entering through the southwest border, and they go across the country via land conveyance. In the past 10 years, the Colombians are still producing their cocaine and heroin. The Mexican cartel have taken over all the major supply hubs in the United States. So Colombians used to control everything east of the Mississippi. They've given that up to the Mexicans, and basically the Mexicans are the importers, the Mexican cartels. So that's been a significant change in the marketplaces. So everything that's coming to us is related to the Mexican transnational criminal organizations at some point. So we get into an open border, greater stuff, and suddenly we get these synthetics. So do you remember back in about 2011 or so, we had the bath salts?
Bath salts.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
So bath salts, actually that was about 2013, I think. Bath salts was kind of crazy because it wasn't scheduled. It wasn't illegal. It could still come through customs and nobody could stop it. It was being sold by certain chemical companies out of Beijing and Shanghai, China. And people with an internet connection and a credit card could suddenly become powerful stimulant dealers with pennies on the dollar, right? So this really takes off. And bath salts was interesting. It's a group of drugs called synthetic cathinones or substituted cathinones. And there's a broad spectrum. On one end is a high hallucinogenic, and on the other end of the spectrum is a super stimulant, much stronger than methamphetamine. And somewhere in between is the perfect product that kind of gives you both. One of the things that flooded our market was MPPV, and ATP was another one. And those were a nice mix of powerful stimulants and psychoactive drugs. And when people were overdosing, they would have episodes of psychosis. So they would see people chasing them that weren't there. They were doing weird things. The body would overheat. They'd take off their clothes.
Yes.
Now, the market, that didn't scare people away from using it. All that happened is when they were using the normal amount of cocaine they would use, and they tried this in the bath salts, they were overdosing because it was that much more powerful than cocaine. So the user groups learned how to back it off and dose properly. That kind of balanced out. But at that time, we start passing laws and we start enforcing it, and you don't hear about the bath salts.
No.
You don't.
No.
We hammered it. And there were some big federal cases in the Bangor Brewer area. They were like the kingpins for the state of Maine, and a lot of enforcement agencies and the feds worked that and really made an impact. I talk about bath salts, and I mentioned the chemical companies out of China. Well, now let's talk about the influx of fentanyl. So fentanyl is a pharmaceutical-grade drug. It's very difficult to manufacture in a clandestine manner. You got to have a chemist, and you got to have the equipment, and you have to have the chemicals to do so. It's not like one-pot meth. Throw some pills in and some lithium and whatever. The point is we didn't really see a clandestine fentanyl in the market, never anticipated it, but they figured out how to do it. The Mexican cartel figured out how to do it. They already had the super labs for the methamphetamine. They already had their chemists. They just needed the precursors. And guess where they're getting the precursors from? The same chemical companies in China that people were buying their bath salts from, or synthetic cathinones. Same outfits. Now, imagine you're a heroin producer. I have to go find a plot of land somewhere that the government's not going to interfere with and that my enemies aren't going to destroy. I've got to go out and have people to plant the poppy seeds. We have to have these poppies go up to maturity. I have to have workers going around slicing the pods, and this resin that comes out that turns into kind of like a scab, if you will, that has to be manually collected, and then I have to chemically convert it into heroin.
Sounds like a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. There's risk involved.
A lot of risk.
It is time and labor intensive. However, if I already have a super lab and I already have my chemists and I have barrels, vats of these chemicals for the precursors and I have the recipe, I can make fentanyl in a fraction of the time. I can make a ton of fentanyl in 2 weeks. And fentanyl has the relative strength of 50 times that of heroin. If you took a kilo of 100% pure fentanyl, I could turn that into 50 kilos of 50% of cut fentanyl that would still have the equivalent potency of 1 kilo of heroin. And that's where the narcoeconomics come in. So you can produce this cheap, you can produce it quickly, you can dilute it 50 times greater than what you could with your heroin product, and you're going to pump it through the same supply chains. We're in this brand new world of synthetic drugs. It's all fentanyl now, just the narcoeconomics of it. Now, for some reason, we get really good at hammering this fentanyl problem back. I anticipate there'll be a new synthetic that comes out, slightly different, maybe not as quite scheduled by law yet. We got to catch up, no different than what we experienced with bath salt. But everything I've talked about is cyclic, how we transfer from one type of drug to the next and how one solution causes a different problem. Again, we take this 1,000-foot view, and you have to say, look, what are the root causes? So we know that a lot of root causes are adverse childhood experiences. That puts a lot of people at risk for a lot of things later in life. What can we do about it? I know there hasn't been glowing reports for Child Protective over the past several years, particularly through the Ombudsman reports, and they're reporting that these child endangered children, that's a big issue. I'm not blaming the workers. The systems are over capacity, and we have to figure out a way to tool that. But that's one area that we could focus on, getting people to work, because when you're working, not only just earning money, but it gives you a sense of purpose. We have to continue to promote these access to treatments or recoveries so there's an off-ramp if you do have substance use disorder. The worst thing I think we can do is to sit back and wait until the person's ready, which kind of follows what these policies that I see in their own time, they'll come around. Until then, we want you to use safely. Certainly, I want them to use safely, but I'd rather that we get them into treatment. I think we need leverage points to do that. So everybody that I've met in recovery has always had a leverage point in their life that circumstances brought them to their knees, and they say, I'm tapping out, I want help. And then they start that hard work. And then you have to have the treatment to plug them into when that moment arrives to make a difference. But when we allow these encampments, you just say, okay, here's your safe use supplies. And the dealers come and they prey on these people and they just use. And every time they use is a roll of the dice. Granted, we have the antidote out there for now. But there may be a new synthetic that comes out that the antidote won't work. We're essentially loving them to death, where I think it might be more impactful if we're really trying to find leverage points to get them started on that journey, knowing full well that there'll be stumbling blocks along the way. I like to equate it to, forget about the public policy. What if this was your child? If your child, I don't care how old they are, were actively shooting up fentanyl, would you make sure every single day to bring them safe use supplies until they're ready? Or would you be doing everything in your power to find a leverage point to get your child on a better path? I know what everyone's going to say.
Of course.
Right. So why would we have public policies that do anything any different? That's the question I have.
Well, to take it a step further, where are those treatment facilities? Thank you for joining us for Part 1 with Brewer Police Chief Christopher Martin. Make sure to tune in to Part 2. You don't want to miss it.
You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at qpointpodcast.com or in your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.